So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session of our Transform event, the Circular Economy, and you're all very welcome. My name is Andrew McIntyre, and I'll be your MC for today's session. As you may know, the Transform series is a new free online seminar that explores the growing impact of digital transformation on business and society, covering a total of 6 areas, ranging from the future of work to smart cities and communities, the circular economy, and many more. Today, we're looking at the 6th of these areas by focusing on how digital technologies are impacting the circular economy. We're delighted to be joined by Clyde Hutchinson, who is a partner at Journey Partners. Clyde will be telling us a bit about airlines and how they are impacting the circular economy, an area that I'm very interested in myself because I lecture here in DCU Aviation. Feel free to send in your questions during the session using the Q&A function, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. Now, please be aware that the chat function is disabled, so only use the Q&A tab. We'll then compile the questions, and I'll ask Clyde to address as many as he can in the time that's available. So looking forward to your questions, and just again, please remember it's the Q&A function as the chat function is disabled. So with no further delay, I'll hand over to you, Clyde.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I just want to point out I'm going to cover more than just airlines. I'm going to go into the deep, murky waters of maritime as well, and maybe a little bit of hyperlift. But what I'm not going to cover is road mobility, micromobility, because I think that's a completely separate topic. So to give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm been involved in innovation and developing startups in the area for a number of years. I have been involved not only setting up innovation labs internally within aviation companies, but also leading the innovation function within an airline. Recently, my attention has been more, how do we invest in the future? How do we invest in these technologies, both in sustainability and digitization of the industry through co-leading Propeller Shannon, which invested in 19 companies from around the world, which was focused on looking at the next generation of travel and startup companies and really focused on aviation and travel, but currently involved in really looking at how to develop a global fund on how to make aviation, transportation, both air, land, and sea, more sustainable. So this topic is really close to my heart, and I'm really glad to be here talking today. So I'm just going to hopefully be able to share my screen and get the presentation up and running. Yep, that all looks good. So, so the time we have today, really, I think the first point is, why should we care about sustainability in aviation? Then I'm going to go on and talk around about the current status and what's going on, both in the terms of airlines, but also in the maritime industry, and then go through what is happening in terms of sustainable aviation fuels and the other fuels such as hydrogen, ammonia, look at some of the more controversial topics such as cold fusion, solar, wind, electricity, and then rounding this off, looking at more of the circular economy events such as offsetting, carbon capture, and what is needed to make tourism more sustainable. So here's some of the facts which have been really in the media quite a lot, that air and sea travel are responsible for a significant amount of emissions in the world. We calculated it's around about 11%, but we've seen calculations everything from 8 to 20%, depending on it. If you add in road transportation, that adds a further 2.5%. And this is becoming more important as during the pandemic that we've seen challenges within the global freight supply chains. That is also then responsible for a further 7% of global emissions. One of the topics which is often not mentioned is the effect of tourism in economies, and especially when we're looking at moving towards circular economy. 14% of global solid waste is produced by tourists when they're visiting various destinations, which is a huge figure. And then of the waste which is in the ocean, which has been much publicized. 40% of this is actually done not only by land activities, but by various maritime activities. And I've seen many videos of cruise ships throwing the rubbish over the bows of their ships, to missing fishing nets, to other activities. So we look at those facts and see that they're quite bleak. And if we look to the horizon, it may seem that there's very little to be done, or there's very little being done at the moment in terms of both the airlines, the aviation industry, the maritime industry. But I'm one of these people who's really positive about the industry, and I think that we're in one of the most interesting times, not only due to the pandemic, but an interesting time where the whole industry is going to go through a revolution. And it's almost like an industrial revolution where we're going to change the whole practice of transportation globally as we move towards a future where we're going to have either emission-free, neutral, or even in some cases, carbon negative travel. So I thought it was useful to look at the current status of what is happening in terms of some of the larger transportation companies. Obviously, AIG is close to people in Ireland's heart, both through Aer Lingus and British Airways, but as one of the biggest transportation groups in terms of aviation and cargo, I thought it's worthwhile looking at what they're doing currently towards being more sustainable, but also towards the circular economy. AIG are completely committed, and this is from the management downwards, to being a net carbon zero by 2050. They're significantly investing in this area, and they've set aside, even in these dark times, 400 million to really look at how they can develop not only the supply chains, but also the new generation of sustainable aviation fuel. Through their startup program and other activities such as Hangar 51, they're investing in the next generation of transport, and we'll talk about Sierra Nevada later on, but also BA are starting to patent their own technologies. Sorry, I should have said AIG are patenting their own technologies. They've also patented a decarbonization technology where they're looking to use an aircraft while it's flying to decarbonate by sucking in carbon dioxide. The tech's not there, but AIG have the patent for that already. In terms of looking at their fleet, as we're seeing the trend across airlines, the movement towards narrow body fleets. During the pandemic, we've seen that British Airways got rid of their last of their 747s. They're also seeing the next generation of engines, which are more efficient, they're quieter, and have a better design in terms of aircraft, where we're seeing more, both Boeing and Airbus being involved in developing the next generation of composites to make the planes lighter and more efficient. One of the companies we invested in Propeller Shannon, Congeletics, is currently working with Hangar 51 and Iberia to really look at how to reduce the waste in terms of food, which are currently happening every day in an aircraft. We've all seen that aircraft cater significantly for passengers, and especially legacy airlines such as British Airways and Iberia. British Airways food budget alone for long haul is over $250 million. So in terms of food waste every year, if there's ways and means of trying to reduce this, and Congeletics company which we invest on is using image recognition to see what type of food is left behind, where there could be savings in terms of food, but also where can there be savings in terms of how you put items on a trolley for sale. And it's also currently, like a lot of airlines, to meet the regulations such as Corsia, AIG are spending approximately around about $3 million a year on offsetting. I thought it's interesting to put a case study on how airlines are currently doing something now to reduce emissions while they wait for technologies. And I thought it was interesting to highlight a really well-run airline in Mexico. I'm saying this because it's a sister from another mother, but Viva Airbus in Mexico is one of the best run low-cost carrier airlines globally. And over the last year, they've partnered with a French startup called Safety Line, which is using big data applications to see how they can improve fuel efficiency in flights. So what they've been doing is that when a pilot is standardly going into ascent, they tend to fix their speed. And there's no evidence that there needs to be a fixed speed. You can vary the speed and also make the plane fly slightly at a slower speed, which will have a dramatic impact in terms of fuel usage. And this is all to do with looking at long-term usage of certain routes and what the ascent's like, and being able to calculate the exact speed a pilot needs to be using to be more sufficient in those flights. And when I say there's significant fuel savings, there's an opportunity here to have 70% of all 70 kilograms of fuel in each climb saved, which can equal 14,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year by simply using a very simple algorithm and training pilots to be more conscious of fuel efficiency. And in Viva Airbus, like many LCCs, pilots are being more and more incentivized and rewarded for fuel savings so that they're integral for looking at these really easy, low-hanging gains which airlines can do now to be more efficient and more sustainable. And this is now making an airline such as Viva Airbus one of the most carbon efficient airlines in the world, because also, as like most LCCs, they're running a new fleet with modern aircraft such as A320s, A321s, NEOs, which are more fuel efficient in every flight. Moving on to Maritime. And Maritime is in an interesting position because Maritime in many respects is ahead of aviation in terms of its adoption of sustainability practice. And we don't know whether this is the fact that a lot of the maritime companies are owned by Northern Europeans or Scandinavians, that this is why they've adopted sustainability practices a lot earlier than the aviation industry. But we're seeing significant advancements by the companies such as Maersk, which is the largest shipping industry. They again are committed to being carbon zero by 2050, but they're actually advancing quicker than they had originally planned. They're due to launch their first carbon neutral ship by 2023, which is 7 years ahead of schedule, which is showing when there's investment and there's commitment that leaps forwards can happen. They also have their own venture capital fund, which has invested in 22 sustainable startups since 2017. They are looking rapidly at how to increase efficiency and thereby reducing fuel costs through digitization. Also, because they are responsible for the majority of the food which we see delivered between continents, they're looking at better systems that they're reducing food waste, so therefore improving the circular economy. They have committed outwardly not to do offsetting, as they say offsetting is a way of kicking the responsibility down the pathway, and instead have dedicated the money which they would use for an offsetting in a dedicated decarbonization institute. So a lot of when we come to talk about the sustainability of fuels and the new types of fuels going into aircraft, we're in a kind of back to the future scenario, because a lot of the fuels which are in play are being developed are not new. Some have been developed 70, 80 years ago, but there's always been challenges in terms of cost, efficiency, supply chain, which have kept them away. And this is really what happened with the first generation of biofuels, which were created for aviation, which were used agricultural biomass, which drew a lot of complaints where this could have been land which could be used to generate food, and it was ethically wrong to use this kind of agriculture for sustainable aviation fuel. More and more, we're now seeing that amongst the many different ways of creating sustainable aviation fuel, the best possible method, especially in places such as North America, where they have substantial waste going to landfills, that this can be redesigned and repurposed into providing a sustainable source of aviation fuel. But not only sustainable source of aviation fuel, a supply chain can be developed around this, which exists already in places such as North America through both the railways and the supply chains for oil. Traditionally, we're seeing the multiple tests which have done, and we've seen a lot of sustainable aviation fuel tests. And I think it's up to the count now is 45 different airlines are using this and have done over 300,000 flights. That it's been done as a 50-50 ratio. There's no real reason to do the 50-50 ratio. It was always deemed as a safe ratio. And more in the near future, we will be seeing more 100% flights which are being fueled by sustainable aviation fuel. The fundamental problem with sustainable aviation fuel is this year we're predicted 100 million liters of SAFs will be produced, but we need billions. And until we get to that level, they're always going to be a little bit more expensive, and there are going to be challenges. And am I going to have enough SAF to fly the plane? But the benefits are immense, and this is something which we can do now today to dramatically reduce carbon emissions by 80% by significant use of SAFs. So it's not 10 years, it's not 15 years. This is something which can be done today to really mitigate dramatically the effects on the environment and on the build-up of carbon dioxide in the environment by using sustainable aviation fuels. The fuels which are being used, the fuels which are being used at the moment, and the ones which are being progressed further are the ones which are called the synthetic fuels. Hydrogen is the one where the biggest bet has been put on in terms of not only European investment, but the European Commission has really seen this as the big bet for emission-free future. Hydrogen is not new. Hydrogen has been used in aviation since the dawn of aviation, maybe not successfully because of the volatileness of it, but hydrogen is a really successful fuel because it has an energy density which is 3 times much better than jet fuel. So therefore, you need less of it. And it can be used in 2 ways in terms of aviation. It can either be used in a fuel cell or in direct combustion or a combination of both. One of the big challenges with hydrogen is how to be able to store it safely on a plane where it can be effectively used. There's been a number of breakthroughs coming through, either making hydrogen a liquid or actually making hydrogen into semi-liquid, semi-solid, which means that it can be more safely stored and transported to planes. But again, similarly to SAFs, the fundamental challenge has been how do we make hydrogen, which is the most abundant element in the universe, how can we make it greener by the processes of developing it? Because at the moment, a lot of the processes require carbon to develop free hydrogen. So therefore, there's been a lot of work done recently to look at new technology to how to make green hydrogen from either extracting it from sludge or using various other technologies to do electrolysis to free hydrogen. However, saying that, it's unlikely that you'll see a commercial jet, which is doing intercontinental flights, using hydrogen as a fuel before the 2030s. An interesting case study of how hydrogen could be used in flight is, as I mentioned previously on the AIG slide, is Avia. This is an emission-free aircraft. As you can see, it's a very small aircraft. They feel that they've done the initial test flights, but they feel that they will have a small aircraft being able to use hydrogen in a fuel cell and then function by 2023. This, over the last 6 months, has received a number of big backers, not only AIG, but Amazon have put in significant funding. Bill Gates' Breakthrough Fund has put in significant funding, as well as Shell, because they see that this is maybe, even if it's only fueling small planes, that this may be the future of where aviation is going, where you have people going in smaller flights in distances under 500 kilometers, which are emission free, going to the smaller regional airports, not flying into Gatwick or a Heathrow, but the smaller airports, which then are easier and better connected to other forms of mobility. However, again, with all other forms of hydrogen, this needs a green and successful supply chain in hydrogen to make it successful. Again, another back to the future of fuel is ammonia. There's a long history of ammonia. And in fact, when the initial designs of the combustion engine were designed back 100 years ago, ammonia was mooted then as a potential fuel for cars. It's abundant, it's cheap, it can be stored as a liquid. There's no carbon emissions when it is burnt, but it does produce nitrox and water, which means that it's more favored by Maritime as a potential solution, because they can do they can do scrubbing of nitrox and being able to make it safe, and also the water can be recovered. It's less popular amongst aviation because it only has the third of the energy density as kerosene, and it's corrosive. So there's challenges about storing it in aircrafts as well. And also you need a large tank to make it efficient for effective use within aviation. The thought is now that they may use ammonia in combination with hydrogen as a combination fuel, but that is still in a long term development in terms of aviation. As mentioned before, it seems that Maritime is a little bit forward thinking in how it uses alternative and sustainable fuels. And here's another case study, which is the Viking Energy, which is currently being retrofit as the first major ship to use ammonia as its fuel. And as you see, this is quite a large ship at 6,000 displacement weight, and it's 311 feet. It's going to run a 2 megawatt engine, which is going to be powered directly by a ammonia fuel cell. And the shipping company Viking are looking to run this over 3,000 hours a year. So it's going to be a significant reduction in carbon when they have this functioning in 2024. Solar and wind. So it's kind of interesting that solar has been looked at since the very early days of aviation as a way of potentially powering aircraft. A lot of us remember this aircraft, which is photographed, which is the Solar Impulse, which did a very, very gentle and slow navigation around the world. But by doing so, it actually was an interesting point where it showed that it was the most efficient way and the most efficient fuel for aviation, because it had a 97% efficiency. However, it's just not practical because of the speed and the number, as you can see, the number of solar panels which are required. I think the solar power may be coming back, but it may take a generation or two for people to look at the photovoltaic cells or other elements of solar to make the technology viable for this. I think solar's use now is really to be involved in the generation of the electric power cells, or to produce the reaction which is required to produce green hydrogen. However, wind has really come back into favor And it's really surprising as the historical usage of how to power a ship, that now large tankers are starting to look as power again, wind to power them again. More and more people, especially in Ireland, are looking at the potential of offshore wind. But offshore wind has been muted as another way of, as I see it, a very expensive way, but muted as a way of producing green hydrogen, and still has to be proven on how the practicalities of how offshore wind can be used to produce green hydrogen. And here's a beautiful case study of how wind is going to be used by major shipping fleets around the world. As you can see, this is a Wallenius or Shella wind, which is, as I say, is stunningly designed. And it's going to be the first ro-ro or roll-on, roll-off ship to be launched in the world. And it's in development, it's being built, and it's likely to launch in 2015. And this will have the capacity of over 7,000 vehicles, so 7,000 cars, and also being able to ship bigger cargo. The benefit of wind and shipping is that traditionally shipping doesn't need the need for speed, so therefore it could quite happily transport at 10 to 12 knots an hour, which is roughly 10 to 12 kilometers an hour. So for us, it's a very slow form of traffic, but within cargo ships, that is a completely reasonable rate to be traveling. One of the more controversial areas which people have been starting to look again at is the area of cold fusion, but also nuclear energy in general, to see if it can be not only involved in shipping, which has had a long history with nuclear submarines, but start to look at how the new technology can be used for aviation. And I think some of us will remember back in the 80s where the hype and controversy around the potential for cold fusion. And cold fusion is producing the same energy the sun produces, but at room temperature. So it has that potential to be an unlimited source of almost free energy for the world. So it's always been seen as an ideal. There's been a lot of controversy. There's been a lot of bad or misrepresented science around it. But today, when we're in the midst of the revolution on how we look at transportation, it's becoming more and more back in favor. And recently, we've seen both Bill Gates and Bezos funding large scale projects. And we're not talking funding 1 or 2 million, we're talking tens to hundreds of millions going into these projects. Interestingly, Lockheed Martin have also patented cold fusion technology for fueling aircraft, but they've been keeping those patents under the military protection. More and more, we're also seeing that shipping companies are looking at cold fusion, but also the next generation of nuclear reactors to power ships such as icebreakers, which are going to be in the newly opened Atlantic as climate change recedes the ice and opening up more and more passages in the Atlantic Sea. So the next section, I'm going to talk more about the impact of the revolution around electricity and actually having both battery powered, but also different aspects of electricity in aviation and other forms of transportation. The picture there is the Wright and EasyJet model of an A321, which they see is going to be the first electric powered from an electric motor, probably a battery, which will carry 186 passengers. They say it's going to need a 1.5 megawatt battery or some kind of electric motor. They're saying this year they're going to do the ground tests and then have their flight tests for certification in 2023. I haven't heard very much about this project, so I'm not sure if this is going ahead. I'm not sure this project will be going ahead, given the challenges we're seeing within airlines. Also, we've also seen Airbus and Rolls-Royce cancel their program, and the CTO of Airbus leaving the company, but setting up an electric hybrid aircraft company. So the using smaller aircraft. So the sense is that it's still very difficult to be able to get batteries which are big enough, which you can carry enough passengers and light enough for this to be a reality. So still, as we mentioned before, when we looked at the hydrogen section, it's likely that electric aviation is going to be really for very small passenger planes, unless EasyJet come through in a breakthrough. An area which has been super hot of late has been electrical drones, or electrical passenger drones, or air taxis, or eVTOLs, depending on how you like to be called. So as we know, looking at urban mobility, the next wave people are looking at is being able to cross cities using some form of taxi drone. There's been a lot of people buying up infrastructure. We personally in Propeller invested in a eVTOL air traffic control software. And it's seen that this will be one of the earliest signs of sustainable urban mobility that we will see in our skies. They are zero or low emissions. Also had the added factor they're removing cars from very busy and congested cities. As I said, it's been a very busy area. Uber exited the market by selling to Joby, who then went on to IPO through a SPAC mechanism. Archer again IPO through a SPAC. A lot of big money is in this. A lot of airlines are investing because they see this as a way of potentially using regional airports to bring passengers to long distance flights, or being able to, in terms of their premium service, being able to offer this to get passengers from JFK into the center of Manhattan. So it's something which airlines are saying not as a threat, but as something which can be a part of their service. Again, there's a big rush to launch, where many of the companies are hoping to have this up and functioning across many cities in the world in 2024. And our personal view is that many cities will be looking to be the first city to have this kind of factor within their mobility systems, because it will be seen as an advantage. For all the Elon Musk fans in the group, I have to also mention Hyperloop. Obviously, Hyperloop has moved into a new era where we're seeing the potential of this to be used in intercity travel, especially in North America. I think the opportunity for Hyperloop, where you're having a deterioration of the intercity rail travel in the US, this is a really good opportunity to start this type of travel once again. And especially companies such as Hyperloop, TT, which have been partnered with infrastructure partners such as the Spanish Via, and also with the Italian Hitachi Rail company, who have a good understanding of how to develop this as an infrastructure. But again, this is a very expensive. This is a very expensive way to do the travel. It could be not a white elephant in terms of cities spending a lot of money developing this infrastructure where a lot of people may not use it. So it's still a long period away. Then finally, let's talk about carbon offsetting and carbon capture. for me, carbon offsetting is problematic, mainly because it has not, in my eyes, and it is a case of argument, being a successful way of dealing with carbon emissions. Traditionally, carbon offsets have been buying or investing in forests or carbon neutral problems. I think more and more what we will see is the impact of the cost of carbon and carbon trading being something which will be becoming more and more important for organizations. But I don't feel it's a responsible thing for corporates to be involved in offsets rather than trying to develop the next generation of technology. And that's purely a personal point of view. As part of carbon offsetting, a lot of companies have been looking at carbon capture, and this is the idea that we can pluck carbon out of the air or capture more carbon in the ocean. Again, this is at a very early stage. It's very expensive. It's very unknown what impact, especially in the ocean, what will happen if you have these big seas of kelps in terms of ecological, how it will change. But again, it could potentially be a future way of doing it. At the moment, the technology are not there. And as with the offsets, there's been a lot of investment and a lot of hype involved in this area. One of the areas which we do look at and do invest in significantly is looking at how to make tourism sustainable. I think the challenge has been a lot of the areas where tourism happens is coastal. 80% of all travel in terms of tourists are in coastal areas. And sometimes those areas are in the most socially deprived regions of the countries which people have visited. So really, to make tourism more sustainable, there needs to be a cheap, renewable energy for these areas. So either solar, offshore wind, or some way of making these areas having a supply of cheap electricity. More and more, what we're seeing in terms of startups is looking at digital applications to reduce over tourism. And this could be anything from virtual tours of busy areas so that you don't visit them, or looking at more experiences and more activities which are in the outskirts or in the remote areas of busy tourism areas. These are important because this not only helps people get wider diversity of experiences, but also can lead to the seasons, which can be short for some certain destinations, be longer, and therefore employ more people in those destinations. As I mentioned before, waste is a huge challenge, especially physical waste, which tourists are providing. So more and more, we need to look at ways of reducing waste, especially food waste, and being more sustainable where tourist areas are and educating tourists around that. Many destinations already are implementing electric vehicles and allowing that to reduce the carbon reduction. And then finally, more and more, there's a responsibility for people who are supplying experiences to be developing these as no harm experiences so that they're not damaging the delicate ecosystems that people are wanting and are coming to these regions to see. So to summarize, who are going to be the winners and the losers as we move through this revolution of sustainability? For me, I think the planet will benefit. We've all noticed the difference the lack of travel has done since COVID. So there is going to be a dramatic reduction in carbon if we maintain this progress. Urban dwellers are going to have a diverse range of cheap mobility solutions. So it's going to make living in a city more pleasurable. So people may stop the the movement out of cities, but also look at living in different parts of cities because of mobility solutions. Again, because of these changes in mobility, we're going to be able to see people being able to disperse, but also work with companies around the world, because we both will be able to access those areas, but also mobility will be easier, cheaper, and carbon free. Where we're going to see the losers are regions which don't necessarily have good access to these technologies or the resources needed to generate free and cheap electricity. More and more, the trend of wide-bodied intercontinental airlines is going to be problematic, not only for cost of fuels, but also less and less likelihood of business travel post-COVID, but also the different forms of transport and people taking smaller trips and smaller sustainable forms of transport. And this may have a direct knock-on effect in Ireland, where Ireland is a major player in aviation leasing. If there's less aviation planes being leased and they don't change their business model to look at these new forms of transport. And then finally, I think what we should be aware of, and we're already seeing at the inequality with the vaccine rollout, is that remote communities may lose out because they don't fit in to the business models which the larger mobility companies will see. So they're not going to get seeing the eVTOLs. They're not going to see small electric planes, and they may become more and more isolated. And we've seen this previously when there's been removal of infrastructure around transportation in the past. As I said, we're always interested in listening in ideas. We'll invest in products. So if you have got concepts around sustainability in transportation and travel, we're always have an open door. And also, as we're building our investment fund, we're looking to invest in interesting projects which are solving real problems, both in the digitization and the sustainability in travel. So feel free to reach out to me. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Clyde. That was very interesting. We have one question that has come in on the Q&A section. And again, I just remind everybody this is the Q&A, not the chat line that we're using here. So the question we have is, has there been any research to commercialize the Edison's nickel iron batteries with the side benefit of producing hydrogen?
It could well be, but it hasn't been filtered down. I think there's going to be one of the big hot areas over the next number of years is going to be batteries. And we're seeing, we already are starting to see smaller, lighter batteries, but the challenge, as pointed out there, we can't rely on lithium batteries because you just can't. We all know we can't have big, large lithium batteries on aircraft, and it's just not going to work. So alternative battery research is going to be one of the key areas where universities are going to play a major part in this, and also are being significantly funded through both the European Commission and the EIC Green Deal projects.
Okay, there aren't any other questions there at the moment, but maybe while we're waiting for some more to come in, I have a question for you, Clyde, from the point of view of, it seems from what you're saying is that there's going to have to be societal changes around the way that we travel, in that a lot of the technologies that are being developed are very much suitable towards shorter commutes and also smaller aircraft, etc. In fact, you said in your slide there that intercontinental airlines and aircraft leasing would be two of the losers. So do you think that society will either accept or have to accept that going into the future?
Well, I think it's already starting to happen. I think organizations are already saying to people who are traveling between offices, do you need to take an aircraft or can you take a train? There's several companies also reward there, and then we're talking about corporates reward their staff for traveling sustainable because they're more and more under pressure now to report ESGs, and this is one of the activities which corporates are going to be enforcing around workers. Also, if it's and especially the teams in, say, JetBlue are saying that we're the COVID has accelerated the era of convenience. So people will want to go to smaller airports because it's more convenient, and take smaller flights because it's more convenient. The challenge is going to be, and I see this with a lot of the legacy airlines, which are going to be so much in debt that they will be looking for more and more efficiencies, especially on long haul flights, which they're making less and less money from. So the experience of those are going to be less and less pleasurable, as more and more the only efficient way of flying will be the LCC model.
Very good. We have another question in here from Harry Kerr. The importance of safety is paramount in aviation. Do these innovations meet the necessary standards?
Yeah, they won't get in the air if they don't. So, and I think the good thing, and I think this is one of the areas where Ireland will do well, because Ireland, the Irish Aviation Authority, is one of the most innovation first organizations. That's why you're seeing people like Bobby Healy and Mano Aero being able to do their trials here in Ireland, is that more and more the aviation authorities want to be seen to be advancing sustainability in aviation. Like I'm in an informal group of people amongst in the European Commission, which we are talking about how do we accelerate the progress in heavy regulated areas such as aviation in terms of sustainability. So the regulators, aviation has always been safety first. There's no way we are going to see this, I think, without the regulators. I think the appetite for moving slow amongst the members of the public, when they've seen that the world's been able to produce a vaccine against the pandemic in a super quick time, and with the help of regulators, I think the appetite will be from the general public to put more and more pressure for regulators to be working better and making more sustainable choices. But I think in a whole, both the IAA and the European regulators are well aware of the challenges and well aware of their role of how they can advance it.
Okay, Clyde, thank you. Another question here. What is your view on pricing? Do you think the costs of travel should be increased for individuals?
So this is an old question. So and it's one which is more and more coming up. So for a number of years, people have been able to offset their travel and clicking a button on when they're picking their plane tickets. Very few people do that. Very, very few people click that button to offset their flights. There's also more and more what I'm seeing, and it's becoming from the OTA side. They are going to put a mandatory sustainability charge on your ticket. So if you're arranging a hiking trip in the Himalayas, they will say, listen, we're going to charge this. We've worked out this is going to cost this much carbon, and we're going to offset this for you. Because individuals, when they're given a choice, tend to not do it, but they don't want to be seen to be doing the bad thing. So Lufthansa did a study recently where they asked people, will you pay $30 more for a sustainable flight? And 80% of people said yes. Of course they're going to say yes. They don't want to be spotted out to being bad people. But I think it's a very difficult one, where I think what it will come up to is that people will become more and more of your carbon number. So as carbon becomes a commodity, you'll be very acutely aware of how much carbon you have used in a year, and can be in the future, this will be something which you'll be taxed on, or maybe not. So I'm not sure, given the choice, will passengers pay more? I'm not sure they will unless they're forced. Should the government be involved in claiming that taxes? That hasn't really worked well in the past in developing innovation. So I'm not sure where that will work. I think what will happen, and what I'm starting to see with some of the travel apps I'm seeing, is that people are given their own personal carbon number. And I think that's potentially what will happen, where you may be given a carbon quota and travel in a year, and you may have to trade with other people. Say if you want to travel to a place where there's not a sustainable way of traveling. So that could be another way of what will happen, that people will be given that carbon quota, and that's that. And if you want more, you have to trade for it.
Just to follow on from that, in trading for it, it obviously means that there have to be you have to buy it. So does that mean that aviation, in your opinion, is going to go back to the way things were, only available to the rich and famous?
So I absolutely, and this is one of the reasons why I hate space tourism and hate Hyperloop and other places, because I fundamentally believe in the democracy of travel. And this is from my time living and working in South America, and the impact where travel can have on businesses and scaling businesses. So going back to this golden age where you have lobster served to you, that will happen to certain people. But I think what we need to find is, how do we do this for the mass population? How do we make this not something for the rich? And I always get thrown at me that the argument is that it always starts as a luxury product, and then it gets democratizes as a product for everybody else. But I think when we're looking at mass mobility, we really need to start to look at the democratization, because that's how you're going to input wealth into nations. And certain, like in like Boeing are predicting over 2,000 new aircraft in the next 10 years. In South America, there's going to be a doubling in numbers, because it's okay, we're all saying this in Europe. In South America, you've got the Andes. You can't drill a hyperloop through the Andes. It's very difficult. Any of you have been on a bus on the Andes, it's not a pleasurable experience either. So therefore, the safest and easiest way is to fly. But we have to make this a sustainable way of doing it, so that we're democratizing this and helping economies, because we're both in Latin America and in Africa, where we're having young people as the majority demographic. They're going to be the workers of the future, so therefore we're going to have to make sure that this is democratized. So yeah, no, I really, yeah, the transport for the rich thing really what makes me angry.
Me too. Another question from Ellen Smith for you, Clyde. Do you think that any more countries will follow ecotourism, like the likes of Bhutan?
So Bhutan's a fabulous country. I think Ecuador are looking at the same pathway, especially with the Galapagos Islands. I think ecotourism is definitely where we're seeing the trend going forward, because people want to have the authentic experience, but they don't want to do any harm. The challenge we have seen within ecotourism, that it tends to be already starting to be corporatized. So you're having corporates coming in and saying, okay, we're going to have ecotourism here, but we'll give you 20% of our profits, but you only can spend that profits in education and health. So they're commercializing these people's culture and heritage, and then telling them what they could spend the money on, which is a kind of neo-colonialism. So I think there's more and more of a trend looking at how to empower local communities to be developing ecotourism, but also being involved in having this as something which is keep retaining young people in the communities, and the variedness of these experiences are also meaning that they are having longer seasons in tourism, so that you are not getting young people which have lack of skills and education going to major urbanizations and being exploited, and they're maintaining in their culture and are developing those culture and experiences. So I think for us, that's really one of the areas which we're looking at. How do you invest effectively and to be impactful and also make profit from doing this? Because this is more and more where people are expecting, and even people on cruise ships are expecting to have these authentic experience.
Okay, another question in here from Melina Shell. Do you think COVID will slow down innovations in sustainable air travel due to financially restrained airlines, or what are we expected to see in the near future?
So the good thing about COVID is got rid of a lot of old aircraft. So it's already made airlines more sustainable as it is, because it's given them an opportunity to retire a lot of old aircraft. The American Airlines got rid of those really scary DC-9s. British Airways got rid of the jumbos, which I'm a little bit sad about, because I love the jumbos. But I think fundamental what the challenge is, we have to show that this is not only sustainable but as a sustainable business model. And the problem with sustainability, it has been left in a lot of the cases in fluffy language and not being brought down to basics of this is going to be fundamentally better for your business model long term for doing this. And if you can show that to airlines, it's going to be beneficial. Of the major airlines, it's going to be they're going to have even more pressure, because in Europe, both Air France and Lufthansa are government-owned airlines now, so they're going to be under pressure from the government to be more sustainable. And I think the myth of sustainability that it's a cost, rather than looking at this is cost efficiency and how to develop it as cost efficiency. So I don't think they will. I think the challenge is in the airlines, there's still immense level of conservatism and trying to get any change in an airline, maybe sustainability, or even for me, like for years, I've campaigned against the magazine in an aircraft, because I come from a public health background, so the magazine in an aircraft was like, it's weight and it's dirty, and and we've finally seen that gone because of COVID, and I'm more than delighted. So it's not to do with resources, it's due to mindset and just trying to change the mindset within airlines. But we're there. I think COVID has really accelerated this, because it's showing that people are more coming out of this. They do want to travel, but people are going to think about sustainability a lot more.
Okay, there's no more questions just in for the moment, but just while we're waiting, maybe for one or two more if they wish to come in. I'd have one from the point of view of the efficiency of air traffic control systems, for instance. Have you had much of a chance to research that? In that, I certainly know, being a former pilot myself, that a lot of the air traffic control systems could be improved because of the fact that you're going across national boundaries, and each nation wants to control its own airspace. So, from the point of view of it's really a global issue. From your research, where do you see that going?
So again, this is almost like an infomercial for IAA, but IAA, again, one of the leaders looking at this, because air traffic control is a very stressful position, and there's a lot of the activities can be automized. So they've been looking at this in a long aspect of how to train, and also what are the aspects which can be automized around this. The challenge we have, and there's several challenges ahead, are the American air traffic control system is creaking very much so, and it's reliant on often outdated technology without a willingness to improve. Also, there's sometimes a resistance within air traffic control to change things because it's so fundamental that you can't make. It's one of the areas such as public in healthcare, you can't make a mistake, because if you make a mistake, then it's toast. So it's a very delicate area. A lot of artificial intelligence applications coming through are going to improve air traffic control so that it becomes more efficient and there's more routineness coming in. One of the biggest challenges always is and this is one of the companies we invested in, Frequency, was that there's always a fundamental problem between the communication between air traffic control, the airport, and the pilots. So if you get that right and get them on the right communication channels and right language, you can make the system a lot more efficient. And you, as a former pilot, would probably had a lot of battles with not knowing what gate you were going into before, or being taxing for an unreasonable amount of time around an aircraft. So all of that is going to change, and I think it's been driven a lot by the airports as well, because the airports are looking at how they can be more sustainable, but also, and I wasn't mentioned here, airports are going to have to fundamentally change because they need to look at non-aeronautical areas of revenue, because COVID has shown that they're so dependent on aeronautical revenue, and people's behavior in airports are going to change post-COVID. People are less likely to eat in an airport. People don't want to be around other people. So there's a lot of challenges there as well. So I think we're going to see a lot more automation, a lot more use of artificial intelligence to help predict behavior, but also help with the communication and the sharing of data between airlines, airports, and air traffic controllers and regulators.
Okay, Clyde, thank you very much. There are no further questions coming in. There's a number of people saying that they really enjoyed the session, so probably that's a good way to end it. Just before wrapping up, I'd just like to thank you, Clyde, for taking the time to give us a very insightful and very interesting talk, and to everybody here for participating in the session. For the future, for those interested, there are more sessions of Transform, the Changing Consumer, taking place at the same time until Friday, the 5th of this week, especially tomorrow with Federica Doni, the Associate Professor in Business Administration and Accounting at the University of the Milano Bicocca. She'll be discussing SDG 13 climate action. On Thursday, then, we'll also be joined by Whole Food chef and author Roseanne Stevens, and founder of Green Outlook, Fiona Smithy, who'll discuss sustainable products and food waste. And then finally, on Friday, we're delighted to be joined by Mary Cronin, founder of the innovation agency Upthink, and the president and founder of Host in Ireland, Gary Connolly. So thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you all again tomorrow. And once again, thank you, Clyde, for a very interesting delivery of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.